Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here with the very end of The Outsiders plus first Dog on the Moon and a bit of a warble rant as well.
I think probably I can only set my mind to what it might mean in terms of employment or the workplace, Jonathan, and that would be that there will be more women at the top, either through quotas or some other way. And as you probably remember, I'm not necessarily in support of quotas, but there will be a change at the top. There will be more women at the top, and that will wreak a cultural change. We will have much more flexible workforces for men and for women. I know we talk a lot about childcare being the necessary link for women to get back into the workforce and to have greater productivity from women in that way. But I suspect that we also need to have that flexibility for men as well. So in 20 years' time, that would be my prediction of what we might see.
A quick thought from you, Sarah Joseph, because time's against us.
I might just quickly comment on, say, that projection, not just for Australia, but for the world. And I think there just has to be great improvements in gender equity because it is really what is most needed for economics and social benefits and sustainability.
And Laura, your closing idea?
Well, at the risk of being in furious agreement with all the other women,
you can.
I just think that the slowing in the population growth in the major developing countries will change the nature of the workforce, and the ageing of the Australian population, brackets contested, will also see women have a much bigger role in the workforce for the next 20 years.
Well, thanks to all three for those thoughts this morning, International Women's Day. And our outsiders this morning have been Laura Tingle, political editor for Australian Financial Review, Paula Mathewson, columnist with The Drum and Hoopla, corporate communications specialist, and Professor Sarah Joseph, director of the Caston Centre for Human Rights Law. 6 to 10 on Sunday Extra.
Aloha, Patriots. Welcome to First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living. I'm still Walkley Award-winning cartoonist for The Guardian Australia, First Dog on the Moon. This week, Eurovision. Remember this? It doesn't get better than that, Australia. Actually, it doesn't. No, seriously. That was ABBA's 1974 Eurovision entry, which of course went on to propel them to international fame and that terrible movie with Meryl Streep. Eurovision is an international phenomenon that simply will not die. And yes, I know you fancy Radio National listeners are far too sophisticated to pay attention or even know what something as daggy and, dare I say it, gauche as Eurovision is. You're too busy reading Quarterly Essay and drinking your kale-infused cold drip AeroPress affogatos. Oh, sure, you've never sat up late at night on your Hessian beanbag and your felted taupe dressing gown and your Gough Whitlamitz time Ugg boots with your TV tuned to SBS showing Ireland's 2008 entry, which was sung by a turkey puppet named Dustin. Here he is now. It's completely awful. Let me explain. The Eurovision Song Contest, or as they say in France, Concours Eurovision de la Chanson, is the annual Olympics of shit pop songs from the countries of mainly Europe, wherever that is these days. This year, however, it's exciting because an Australian's been invited to enter. If you've successfully avoided Eurovision up till now, those days are over, and you can't even blame Tony Abbott. For our entry, Australia's chosen to send this guy, Sebastian. He doesn't even have a last name. What a poser. And this was after an extensive and extremely secret search undertaken by nobody knows who, or the criteria they used. But we can have a guess at them. We reckon you have to be able to get to Vienna in May, be completely terrible, and sing an awful song. That's about it. you don't even have to be a person. You could be a flightless bird with someone's arm up your wedding hole, and maybe that's how they selected this Sebastian guy. We do know, however, that there were a great many unsuccessful entries because we've obtained a CD. Remember those? It contains 20 of the top 10 Australian music acts who were too awful to even get into Eurovision. Here's some of them now. First up, it's the Tanya Pliberseekers with their rousing rendition of Take This Job and Shove It.
You can take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more.
Or how about Death Culture Club with Boy George Brandis as lead vocalist and Tony Abbott on euphonium? Here they are singing that patriotic classic, John Williamson's Hey True Blue. And then there's the Kevin Andrews Family Jug Band with Kevin on spoons and Mrs. Andrews on the jug. Here's their entry entitled, I'll always have a $200 voucher for marriage counselling in my heart for you. And what about Craig, Emerson, Lake and Palmer? Here's their version of Whyalla Wipeout.
No Whyalla Wipeout there on my TV. No Whyalla Wipeout there on my TV. No Whyalla Wipeout.
How they overlooked that one, I have no idea. This CD is available in all good ABC shops and even the terrible ones. And there are so many, many more. The Anthony Albanese beats featuring Ed, Please Don't Stop the Hoosic. There's also Adam and the Bands, Crosby, Stills and Fiona Nash, Eat Your Young, Kim and Bob Are the Cars, Feeney and the Machine, and finally, Put Them in the Van Morrison with their version of Bron to Be Wild.
Get your motor running. Head out on the highway.
So there you have it, Australia. If you thought 2015 was going to be a long and painful year, you haven't seen anything. Of course, you could be locked up on Nauru, so stop complaining. And thanks for listening, Patriots. This has been First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living, proudly brought to you by the First Dog on the Moon Institute. You're welcome.
Born to be wild.
And that is it for Sunday Extra today. Don't forget the podcast on iTunes. Thanks to Elizabeth Coolers.
Well, interesting. The outsiders had nothing to talk about but Tony Abbott's dead cat bounce in the polls. And First Dog on the Moon was worried about the Eurovision Song Contest and a fuzzy-headed bloke called Guy Sebastian, who's somehow magically been selected to represent Australia in the sad, tawdry kitsch music of the world competition, because now Australia can compete in Eurovision. Well, I suppose Australia's fighting under what's essentially a North Atlantic Treaty Organisation chain of command in NATO and Iraq, flying out of Dubai. I didn't realise that Australia had such a long length of North Atlantic coastline in Afghanistan, but apparently that's, de rigueur these days when it comes to trying very hard to become the 51st state of the Union, ruled out of Washington and the Pentagon. It's kind of puzzling to me that the Australian population is sitting still while being dragged into war by successive Australian Prime Ministers who reflexively support whatever they think America wants to be supported, sometimes being so highly supportive of the American or the Australian perception of the American desire that Australia actually announces its commitment to a campaign before America has called for volunteers. I know that's how Bob Hawke and Johnny Howard got us involved in 2 different Iraq wars and invasions, and we're back into it against ISIL once again, like we're volunteering troops before the Americans have asked for them. I don't know why the Australian population sits still for that. I really don't. It's got a 100% record of not actually working out particularly well. You know, once upon a time, Australia relied on Great Britain, and we supported British foreign policy, whatever it was, regardless. Now we support American foreign policy, whatever it is. And the Australian population as a whole doesn't seem to pay any attention to the fact that America commits its troops, its air forces, its naval task forces to suppress the enemies of King Sword and the enemies of any other OPEC signatory nation. They've been doing that since about 1973, when America was broke from losing against North Vietnam. The American dollar was worth nothing. They'd gone off the gold standard and their currency was tanking on the international markets. And Nixon went over and signed a deal with OPEC such that the Pentagon provides mercenary forces to defend the oil fields of every nation in OPEC, and that boils down to America suppressing the enemies of whatever government is running the OPEC countries. And OPEC pays America in dollars because it only sells oil for dollars. So ever since America went to a volunteer army at the end of the Vietnam era, when conscription was abolished, they've been calling for patriotic volunteers to go and fight in mercenary wars wherever King Sword has an insurgency he wants to suppress. Iraq 3 times, Libya, Afghanistan. You know, like what was in Afghanistan? Was it the Taliban? No, the Americans put the Taliban in government in Afghanistan. The Taliban were the United Nations recognised government in Afghanistan, but the Taliban were playing hospitable hosts to a bloke called Osama bin Laden. America invaded Afghanistan because King Sword's rebellious nephew, Prince Osama bin Laden, was staying in Afghanistan. Wherever in the world King of Saudi Arabia has an enemy, America is suppressing it, or trying to. And it's getting bogged down and it's running around like a bull elephant in a china shop with a stick of ginger up its ass, and it's making new enemies everywhere it goes. It's totally ridiculous for Australia to be unthinkingly committing itself to be a leading edge ally of America when America is in unguided idiotic phase on the world stage. But because it takes the population's mind off Tony Abbott's dismal domestic popularity polls, he keeps ramping up the Anzac Day bugle playing military card. And Anzac Day is approaching. We are coming up on the 100th anniversary of Australia invading Turkey. And I'm sure Tony Abbott will have bugles blowing and flags waving. Apparently he gave a press conference recently where he stood in front of about 8 Australian flags draped all across the background. He couldn't pull on the patriotic puppet strings any harder than he is doing without risking having them breaking off. It's really kind of sad that the Liberal Party knows that it will schism and fall to pieces if they don't leave Tony Abbott in charge of things, and Tony Abbott is leading to the abyss. But there's big Mr. Whitetail having a drink. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Keep on keeping on. Ciao.